Hey guys, Buffer Game back today, bringing out a video, and today we're going to be covering the Exodus build-up for Battlefield 2042, that being the journey of the Notepad. So there's been three little story kickoffs here over on the Battlefield website. I'll go ahead and link this down below. We have a nice interactive map as well as key points here along the map that they've been doing the past 3 days that's kind of building the story of the Battlefield 2042 universe up to the Exodus short film that's going to premiere on August 12th here early next week. So that'll be a 9-minute film, again, covered on YouTube, which I'll definitely be covering that. But I'm going to link this down below so you guys can read through this in more detail. I'm just going to briefly cover the first 3 kind of short stories slash episodes they've done here that's building up to that short film, giving us the background. And the cool thing here is that we're actually covering all of the maps for Battlefield 2042's core multiplayer. And we've covered 3 of the locations so far, being Dohan, which is the Hourglass map in Dohan, Qatar. We have Discarded, which is in India, and then Manifest, which is in Singapore. All of that's covered so far within this story, and it seems like tomorrow's episode of this is going to take place in the South Korean map, that being Kaleidoscope. So that should be an interesting one as well. The story so far is really good, so I'm just going to kind of briefly go over this. We'll look at some of the maps and things like that. So if you're not familiar, this is following the journey of reporter or journalist, I should say, Kayvan Bechir, who is basically an investigative journalist looking to learn more information about the Notepads and kind of ends up almost becoming one of them and getting sucked into this. So first off, part 1 is called Escape from Doha, which again takes place on the map Hourglass, and that's that sandy map that we've seen previously in the trailers, that city skylight all lit up by LEDs where the sandstorms come in. And that was also in the first gameplay trailer that we saw, where you're flying in the helicopters over the stadium into the city. So this is the map that we're talking about here. So Escape from Dohan, and basically the journalist Kayvan, we'll just call it by the first name for the purposes of this video. So Kayvan is essentially looking online to learn more about the Notepads, and early in the morning at around 3:28 a.m. is contacted, gets a direct message by somebody claiming to be Oz. So Oz is supposedly the most wanted man alive and the commander of the largest contingent of Notepads forces. So Kayvan also says that he's received messages like this in the past, so not too sure, but it ends up actually essentially being Oz. And this conversation ends with Kayvan's door getting kicked in. So now Kayvan is on the run, essentially, and out in the city trying to get away, and was left with information from Oz as to where to go. And then in the city skylights, the LED buildings, there's hints, and the Notepad sign is seen, which is basically a box with a line through it, or that N, and goes into more information about the city too. But basically Kayvan is going to get led through breadcrumbs by Oz that are placed throughout the city, and ends up meeting one of our specialists that we know is the Russian operator Boris. So real name is being Petr Bukovsky. So Boris kind of meets up with Kayvan here and kind of takes Kayvan into a tunnel, and then they go off to part 2. But some information is covered in this part 1 of the short story here, Escape from Dohan, gives us some more information about the city of Dohan, or Qatar. And essentially what's going on here is it used to be a flourishing city in the 30s because of the oil that was being refined there. So this was a flourishing city, one of the top cities to be in. And then essentially at the end of the 30s, the sand started creeping in, and technology was unable to keep the sand from overtaking the city. And fast forward to now, the 40s, the sand had become to Dohan what water is to Venice. So essentially there's just sand throughout the city. And it goes into the name that it used to be called the Court City because of the thriving LED skyline. And now the country invested heavily in combating the desertification, hoping to copy Egypt's success, which Egypt is going to be another map that we'll see here in the multiplayer. And then for a time it mentions that they seem that they might win against nature and tame the desert. Then the oil ran out and everything just kind of went downhill. Famine, failed responses to them, the government protest, all accompanied sand monsoons, which again overtook the city. And then now it's basically a wasteland. The only people that are there are the people that don't have the money to leave. And luckily, with Kayvan following the breadcrumbs and meeting up with our specialist Boris, he is now out of the city. So that brings us to part 2. Now, part 1 here, it takes place in September 12th of 2041. So if we go to part 2, the Magic Act, this takes place in Alang, India on November 1st, 2041. So just shy of 2 months later after part 1. This takes place on the multiplayer map that we're going to be knowing as Discarded. So this is that basically ship scrapyard that we saw in the multiplayer trailer briefly. And this picks up almost 2 months after fleeing Dohan. Oz's breadcrumbs led me to a safe house made of shipping containers in India, filled with notepads armed to the teeth. And then it goes into basically just kind of allowing you to resonate with the notepads, that they're just everyday people that you could see were nightclub owners, doctors, some were ex-military, like we know of Boris. And then we're also introduced to a new specialist, that being Navin Rao, a notorious Indian hacker and ex-Marcos officer. So Navin is going to be useful here when we get into part 3, the Coyote. But the goal here in part 2 is basically to commandeer his ship, because they need a ship to transport some of the refugees. And basically this port here in Alang, India, is one of the major shipping components in the world at the time. And they're able, it's also known for one thing that's called magic, so that's why it's called the Magic Act. Basically, how else could you explain freighters vanishing into thin air only to be discovered months later amongst the ever-growing notepad fleet? So basically, the businessmen and owners were reselling these ships to the notepads, who were probably paying good money to get these ships. And what it says here is that corrupt businessmen were selling ships intent on scrap, so they were supposed to be scrapped, to the notepads on the black market, but the Indian military would soon put a stop to this. So for a brief time, the ships that were supposed to be scrapped here in this scrapyard were kind of touched up and resold to the notepads. So then it basically details their escape from India, getting into open waters with 25-foot waves, and they're finally out of there, and the Magic Act is completed when we vanish across the 21st parallel. Our beat-up old container ship, unofficially dubbed the Copperfield because of the Magic Act. So beginning my journey as a notepad. So, and basically dubbing Kayvan as a notepad himself. So we get to part 3 here. Again, this is going to be called the Coyote Run. So this takes place in February 19th of 2042. So again, a few months later, and this takes place again on another multiplayer map, that being Manifest in Singapore. And this is actually a very interesting one. The map looks beautiful, so I really hope the map itself kind of ends up getting expanded to what we're seeing here in some of the images. How big will this map actually be? Because this looks like an awesome map, and it's surrounded by a seawall. So what it establishes here is essentially the Notepad ship is coming into Singapore because they have additional refugees. These are being 65 Australian refugees that were added are being added to their resume or their ship manifest. So it says that I held my breath when our next stop appeared through the mist. It was a pin drop silence as our ship passed through the seawall protecting Branny Island in Singapore's state-of-the-art automated seaport. So again, this is Singapore. They have an automated seaport or a seawall here, basically saying that Ryo's wizardry may have gotten us convincing credentials for the scanners, but I knew if the famously brutal Singapore Port Authority, the SPA, get a whiff of this boat, it would get really loud real fast. So our new specialist there haven't been able to basically hack into things and get them through. And then it goes into some more information that by the 1930s, the rising sea levels had decimated a third of all commercial ports around the world. In a deft response, Singapore built a revolutionary seawall to defend its AI-driven cargo distribution system, making Branny Island the central hub for global trade. So the Notepad's problem was bad PR. Some of the terrorists that had been caught were essentially called themselves Notepads, which gave Notepads almost a bad rap. So bad PR, everyone kind of associated Notepads with terrorists, and that wasn't really the case. So it also shows another image here of the port itself, saying that the port is fully automated at Branny Island, but no system is invulnerable to hackers, which is where our new specialist will come in there. And then by some miracle, they're able to dock undetected. And as they're loading up the refugees, the SPA actually finds them and ends up attacking them. So they have to get out of there really quick. Then they get back out of the the automated seawall into the open waters. And here's where it gets interesting, is we kind of get a little hint as to the size of the Notepad forces, basically saying that the SPA, or the Singapore Port Authority, pursues them into open waters. Gunfire, screams, more gunfire, silence. Then I hear ear-splitting cannon shot. My heart stops as I wait for the impact when I realize where the blast originated from. a constellation of vessels on the horizon. It's a NOPAT fleet, so fishing trawlers, container ships, tugboats, and more, all is making up this NOPAT fleet. There's no telling how many are armed, how many of the ships are armed, and the SPA has no interest in finding out. They turn tail and run back to the port. It seems among the 1.2 billion displaced, so giving you a size of the NOPAT army itself, the 1.2 million displaced out of the world, this task force has at least a few friends. So that's where we end part 3, the Coyote Run. Part 4 is going to take place tomorrow, and that's going to be on the map Kaleidoscope, like I said, here in South Korea. So that should be pretty interesting. Again, this is all building up to the Exodus short film, which is going to essentially take place right before the game goes live, and where we pick up in the timeline, at least. So it should be pretty interesting. Again, we saw a lot of maps here, that being Hourglass, which is in Dohan, Qatar, Discarded, which is in Alang, India, and Manifest for Brandy Island, Singapore. So tomorrow we'll see Kaleidoscope in South Korea, and then after that, Orbital in the French Guiana Islands, and then Breakaway and Renewal. So we should see all of these, and Renewal should be interesting because that's in Egypt, and that goes back to the first story there of Doha, how they were unable to kind of combat the desertification like Egypt did. So on the Egypt map, Renewal, we see how half is desert and half is just lush green grass everywhere. So that should be pretty cool. Again, we saw some introduction of at least 3 specialists here. We saw Casper in the storyline. We saw our Russian operator as well as our new operator, Navin. So it should be pretty cool to see where this goes. Again, leading up to that live action film, we saw some really cool shots of these maps, specifically the Brandy Islands in Singapore. The seawall looks awesome. And if you look at that picture, you can see the open waters are just very rough, high waves and swells. And then inside of this automated seawall, the waters are nice and calm. And it looks like a lush, awesome city. However, you do see a lot of smoke and oil refining going on in the distance. So this is a map that I really like to play a lot more. I think it looks really, really cool. Let me know down below what you guys think, what you're hoping to see from Kaleidoscope. I know the closed playtest session goes live next week, so that should be pretty interesting if we get any leaks out of that. And then, again, leading up into the open beta here in September, which will also be good, right into release in October. So pretty excited. Let me know what you guys think. I'll cover this a little bit more here and there, as well as when we get to the Exodus film itself is released. We'll be going over that and seeing what weapons and operators, specialists, things like that are introduced within that video or the short film. Till next time, this is Buffer Gaming.